whether by choice or not, we are seeing more and more negotiations happening virtually. And the term virtual is quite simply not face-to-face. So as you can imagine, virtual covers both the asynchronous version of emails back and forth, texts back and forth, back in the day, faxes back and forth, but also virtual includes video conferencing. And these are all a little bit different. So let's break this down. So as I mentioned, you've got these different options available to you. And ideally, where there is a choice, the richer the communication channel, the better. Why? Because as you may have heard in other classes or in other contexts, the words we speak account for only 7% of the meaning that we transmit in conversation. The rest of it comes through body language and tone of voice. And you can imagine in a negotiation setting, you have a lot that's going on that is said and that is not said, and being able to read those messages is really important. Now, having said that, one thing I want to make clear is that just because somebody folds their arms across their chest doesn't mean they're angry or defensive. Body language is a little harder to accurately interpret, and we'll talk about that. So as an example, and why the more richness in terms of both voice, real time, and video is important is because a speaker can think that he or she communicates a real clear message, unequivocal. I need this delivery as soon as possible, thinking tomorrow. Whereas the listener who is looking at the body language in addition to the words may have interpreted a little bit more of a relaxed, well, whenever you can get it, get to it. So this is why not only having more richness, but also being synchronous, where somebody can immediately give feedback. Okay, when you say as soon as possible, do you mean this week, this month, this quarter? And this gives you a chance for that back and forth communication. So while I think many people might see having a negotiation virtually as filled with disadvantages, there actually are some clear advantages, and they include, first and foremost, the fact that we can have conversations or negotiations with just about anybody around the world. No longer is distance a barrier to having a negotiation. Anybody who has access to technology can be involved in a negotiation, and doing so very inexpensively. It also, by the fact that we have the ability to use these tools not just as an asynchronous mechanism, but also synchronous, we can do real-time data gathering. So for example, you could be inside a car dealership, and while you're being left alone for the salesman to go talk to the manager, pull out your phone and get the latest information on what's out there. You could call a friend, so to speak. You could even do a quick check-in, do a live Facebook video feed where you're asking everybody, okay, we're down to car A and car B, here are the pictures, thumbs up or thumbs down, which one? And I think there's a story in the text about a mayor, I think it was of Berlin, who within a negotiation was actually using either Facebook or Periscope to get that real-time data while a negotiation was happening amongst the various members of the city council. Another benefit, and this is kind of a double-edged sword, another benefit is that having these conversations mediated by technology can, in a positive way, reduce nonverbals that especially portray or enhance the power differences. And as one example, there, I think it's in the text, there was a case of a very contentious divorce, and the woman was very emotional and concerned and fearful of her soon-to-be ex-husband, the way that he would overpower her emotionally, psychologically, physically, and she would break down in tears every time they would try to make some movement towards a resolution in their divorce. And a judge, noticing this, actually decided to take the two members of this negotiation into two separate rooms and use technology to have the conversation essentially virtually, even though they may have been under the same roof, but without the sound and the volume and the physical presence and the impact that that had on her, they were able to come to a resolution. So that's a really interesting benefit that you can imagine comes from having negotiations virtually. If it's virtual and also asynchronous, this process allows for considerable time. So instead of being put on the spot or being felt that you're being put on the spot, take it or leave it, or this offer expires in 10 minutes, or we're closing soon, when you have the ability to use time within a virtual negotiation, even if it is synchronous, I think it's a little bit easier to stand your ground and say, I hear the immediacy that you're looking for, but actually I need to take 24 hours and sleep on this. And so I think it's a little bit beneficial that way within virtual negotiations. Of course, there are challenges. And as I mentioned already, because there is such a smaller range of richness to the communication without body language and tone and proxemics and haptics and all these different elements that add to the message, it increases the chance for misinterpretation. And especially when it is asynchronous, there's not that chance for immediate clarification or feedback. There's also some research that suggests that in a virtual negotiation, there is a likelihood of diminished personal rapport, thereby limiting the formation of trust, which is so essential, particularly in integrative negotiations. Moderated by eye contact simply means that where there is a virtual negotiation that is a video conference, that diminishing of personal rapport is much smaller of a diminishment. There's also some research that suggests within a virtual negotiation, parties are less likely to disclose information. Maybe there's this feeling of, okay, this will be recorded and it'll be used against me sometime in the future. Or if we're emailing back and forth, there's this paper trail. And related to that, some research suggests parties may act less ethically in that there won't be a paper trail, so I can kind of expand on the truth, stretch a little bit without so much concern that someone's going to check on that. Again, whether you will do that or the party you will negotiate with will do that, it's hard to say, but there's some research that suggests this. Another challenge to virtual negotiations is that sometimes, as wonderful as technology is, it fails. And I think we've all experienced the Zoom freeze, right? So what is the likelihood that this will happen? What's our backup plan? What other mechanisms do we use? And more, you may see in commercial and governmental negotiations a need for a secure platform. I was running part of an executive program with an organization I won't name, and they disabled the chat. And they disabled the chat because of security concerns. And even though I was one of the faculty, I had very limited control over the Zoom platform. So that's another issue that is a consideration. Within the virtual environment, all the cultural differences we see in greetings and physical distance that is normal, and the need to save face, for example, still apply in some ways, makes it more difficult, right? So, how we read the other person is more of a challenge when we're not standing in the same room with them. And another challenge is if the negotiation is not just virtual but also asynchronous, this extends the time. So on the benefit side, this is a good thing because it gives us time to do additional data gathering, ensure there's consensus on our side, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're in need of a quick answer or resolution, sometimes the virtual negotiation setting, especially if asynchronous, can work against that goal. So what are some things you can do to improve both the process and the outcome of a negotiation that is carried out virtually? And by the way, some of these negotiations are half and half, part and part, right? So you may start a negotiation face to face, and because you didn't get done, or you only come to some consensus on some but not all of the issues, the remaining pieces may happen online, over email, over video conferences. With any luck, we will not be dealing with COVID forever. And so again, it's something to think about, that there be these mixed mode negotiations. But notwithstanding, what are some things you can do before? Well, make sure that the details and logistics are very, very clear. Are we using Zoom? If so, whose platform are we using? Who's coming? Who's not? What technology is being used? What's our backup plan in case the Wi-Fi goes down? And are we all in agreement to record this or not? So clarifying is important. And there are obviously a lot of things that have been written in the last 6 to 9 months about what makes for good a good picture when you're in a video conference, and obviously good lighting and a simple background as opposed to a very busy background, and to the degree possible being able to turn off the phone and the noise on the phone, shut the door, instruct people around you to not interrupt over the next hour while you're having this meeting or negotiation. Here's another before. This should look no different from any negotiation, but the reason that I'm saying it is because when we are sitting in the comfort of our homes and we know that people are only going to see that part of our face that the computer camera captures, there's this temptation to have all of our notes around us and maybe a second computer or monitor where we can gather additional information real time. So as in any negotiation, the more prepared you are, the more confident and the more competent you feel and come across. So if you're trying to wing it because you think you can in this virtual environment, I recommend resisting that temptation. Also a good idea to do a test run. If this is a multi-million-dollar contract that you're negotiating, might not be a bad idea to do a 5-minute call the day before or the morning of the afternoon, just to make sure that all the issues are worked out as needed. And here's another little tip. Depending on with whom you're negotiating, just as you might in a traditional negotiation, whether it's a job offer or two organizations trying to have some sort of agreement on price or a joint venture, take a look at your and their social media. The their part is pretty obvious, right? Of course, you want to know what they're doing, what their latest issues are, how they've responded to Black Lives Matter, whatever is relevant. But check your own social media, because they will too. So know what they know about you, and that would help you prepare. All right, so you've done your prep before, and now the meeting is about to begin. One thing to keep in mind is to try to recognize that while technology is a big part of facilitating this meeting, we are human beings. And it is so critical to remember the human. And there's this great article, which you should be able to find, and if not, I will upload it. 5 big problems in the virtual world. Nick talks about lack of feedback, lack of empathy, lack of control, and a lack of display of emotion. And because of that, there's this minimum connection, which translates into a minimum kind of commitment. If I don't see you and feel you and hear you, my commitment to our moving forward is going to be strained. So because of this need to really remember the human, be mindful about your and their verbal and nonverbal cues. Some would suggest go over and above what you normally would do. The normal, yay, that's great, or yay, that's really great. So kind of recognizing that some of the emotion is going to be automatically muted. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, I mean that in a figurative sense. Be mindful about giving those emotional cues, show that emotion. And if you're not getting it on the other side, ask the question to clarify, okay, you said yes. Is that a resounding yes, or is that just, okay, fine, we've been at this long enough, let's get this done. So remember the human. Part of remember the human is in the same way that you would do if you were in a physical meeting where there's this sort of chatter, the informal chatter, the hey, what was last weekend like, or hey, what was that snowstorm like, that kind of water cooler check-in, whether it's minutes before the actual start of the meeting or during the start of the meeting. It's a good idea to break the ice, build rapport, and don't ignore that natural conversation just because you're meeting virtually. There's also some research that suggests having that small talk reduces the impact of the demographic differences, whether it's age or sex or cultural differences, because then we're all alike. We're in this together. We're similar, as opposed to being so different, which some of those demographic differences are actually highlighted when you see just a face on the screen. So remember the human and kind of break the ice and try to build rapport and trust, but also don't forget to do those formal introductions. The credibility of the message is directly tied to the credibility of the messenger. And if you're not doing these formal introductions, you lose that window of opportunity to build the credibility about who you are, why you're the best person to negotiate with, etc. And even somebody who may be present at the meeting who is a stakeholder or a facilitator or a meeting lead, make sure to include that person too. Most people feel uncomfortable when there is a person who is present physically, and by physically I mean on a Zoom screen, at a meeting, but not having been introduced. Like, why are they there? We get suspicious. So make sure everybody is introduced. Try to encourage people, if especially there's been a habit in the opposite, to make their cases compelling. That anytime somebody has a disagreement or a counter argument for what is being discussed, to try to make their case compelling in 60 seconds. And easier said than done, of course, but to not say this 60-second rule or suggestion would be to invite people droning on. And I think, can't speak for you, but being zoomed out, we have found ourselves in meeting after meeting after meeting, and perhaps even attending multiple meetings at the same time, which you can do with the benefit of Zoom. So try to be clear about what we're doing, and keep the time as short as possible, and also keep people to not droning on. And similar to the point I just made earlier about attending multiple meetings at the same time. If you say up front, this is framing, right? If you say at the start of the meeting, we're going to meet for 45 minutes, and while I realize that all of us has a lot on our plate, is it possible that for the next 45 minutes we turn off our phones, we turn off our second monitors, and we just roll up our sleeves and engage in this conversation or negotiation? So make that appeal verbal, make it clear, make it upfront, and this is a mechanism for framing and for managing expectations. So during a virtual negotiation or meeting, don't just, as in the case of a physical face-to-face, don't just allow the people who talk the longest and loudest to talk. Create opportunities, ask questions, facilitate, and ensure that people do participate meaningfully, not equally, but meaningfully. That if you've noticed that Jane hasn't said anything in the entire meeting, or maybe her entire participation has been limited to chat that nobody seems to be noticing, ask the question out loud. Hey, Jane, what are you thinking? Are you on board with this? Or I like the opposite sometimes, the question, is there anything you object to that we've been talking about? So kind of phrasing that in the negative. What don't you like about what's going on? You also don't have to do all of that verbally. For those of you who have gotten to be pretty good with Zoom, you realize that there are polls, breakout groups, different ways of getting people to weigh in, and do use those tools. It kind of minimizes the status differences because everybody is in a breakout room, everybody is invited to use the chat, and this is a good way of really encouraging meaningful participation, as well as process tools where someone says, okay, I'm going to ask everybody to weigh in on this issue, and I'm going to go around the room with my screen on Zoom, because you know everybody's screen's order of participants is a bit different. Minimize the number of slides. I only have 8. Check assumptions. Paraphrase early and often. Again, really not a lot different than a face-to-face, because we get lost sometimes in the soup. We get locked in agreement and ask the same question over and over. It's even more imperative during a virtual negotiation to check in, to clarify, to demonstrate active listening, and to check the body language, right? So to the degree that you can see parts of individuals' bodies, recognize that you might pay attention to that and ask the question, gee, Janie, I noticed that, in this last question, I didn't, everybody else was nodding their head up and down, and I didn't notice that you did that. What are you thinking? And here's the interesting thing. There's some research that suggests that our body language is actually more honest than the words that come out of our mouths. That the limbic system that exists inside all of us is kind of part of that fight or flight response. And so whereas we can be high self-monitors and be careful about what comes out of our mouths, our body language is potentially more honest. And then similarly, again, to face, but perhaps not as obvious, is when you're in a breakout room and you've got, a multi-party or a team-based negotiation, you might be thinking, oh no, now what do I do? Now we can't caucus. Well, that's not true. It just requires a little more creativity. Entering an empty breakout room on Zoom, or even muting the sound and the video and asking your partners to get on a quick FaceTime call or a phone call or something like that. So don't avoid the benefit of a caucus or a timeout just because you're in a Zoom, for example, platform. So as you're nearing the end of a virtual meeting, it's a really good idea to clarify what we've decided, what we're still thinking about, who has what follow-up tasks to do. Because again, as much as the words and the body language don't always match, it's even more important in a in a virtual environment. Clarify what's next in terms of resolving the open issues or items and what's next in the next meeting. And then finally, especially if this group or this negotiation is going to occur over multiple sessions, it's a good idea to do a check-in. Hey, how did we do? What should we pay attention to next time? For example, we started late or we had these technology glitches, but just check in, the positives and the deltas. What do we want to change next time? Or the B's and C's, the benefits and concerns. It could be a 5-minute around the room kind of thing, but it's the thing that in teams helps to alleviate the need for the meetings between the meetings, if you know what I mean.